right, Hickok 45 here, and the year is 39,887, and I have a shotgun. Let me prove it.
I was one of the lucky many to get invited into the Darktide Closed Beta this past weekend, and I will tell you, I had a lot of fun with it. It was just a single weekend, and that was pretty much the one thing that was just on my mind. I was either playing it or just thinking about what I was gonna do to play it. Like I was like clearing stuff aside so I can get as much time as I could out of it, you know. And with that, I had a couple of thoughts that I would like to share, and totally not because I need an excuse to make I have a little bit more variety in my content, you know. Now, to kind of blow past the technical aspect, because there were some tech issues that can be excusable, some that cannot. In short, the game is beautiful. The graphics are great. There's a lot of different eye candy, and they did take the time to implement stuff like DLSS, FSR, and video reflex. But at the same time, I go from the video section or the video menu to the input menu, and I see that it can't change my mouse sensitivity. I don't know either. I did have some small stutters and freeze-ups as well. There were many times where I was in the thick of combat and my game would lock up, or my game would freeze for multiple seconds at a time, and then my game would unfreeze and I would see that my character was incapacitated, it was almost comical at times, the timing or inconvenience of it all. But then again, yeah, it's closed beta. They're working on it. That's one of the things they're trying to improve and all of that. But again, those situations were few and far between. What's more interesting to talk about, though, is more of the gameplay or how it actually plays out and feels. I've said plenty of times over the weekend on stream that if you are coming in from Vermintide 2, you could come in and treat this game as if it were just Vermintide 2 again, or Vermintide 3, and play the game as if it were Vermintide, and you would have absolutely no issues. You would do fairly well. It is still the same formula. Then again, there were several changes or improvements made on this formula that, in my opinion, made this game feel a much better to play. The two big ones, in my opinion, are the removal of the class limitation per squad, as well as the toughness system. So instead of playing one of 4 named characters in a D&D party, you instead create your own character. You pick from one of 4 classes, and you go through a mini character creator, similar to like an MMO or something similar to like Final Fantasy 14. That was kind of the vibes I was getting, and up to and including giving them their own name, which does show up in game. Some players would just use a name that the game gives them, as you can just let the game randomly pick a name for you to use and roll with that. And then you have some others that would just write their own within reason. It'd be interesting that you have some that would have a name that would be somewhat fitting for the 40k universe, and then you would see in the same party something like a Simplord 69 or something like that. It was comical. I also saw some creative ones, like someone went in Ogren, so one of the bigger guys got red clothing and then named their character Mario, which I found to be somewhat humorous. From a story or like writing perspective, it doesn't make sense because the 40k universe is grimdark, so it's reinforcing the fact instead of being some named hero that is doing their best to save the day, you're just some nobody. Fatshark's official Twitter account for Darktide refers to the player base as rejects, because that's who you are. Your character has been convicted of a crime, and you've been sentenced to doing mercenary work, which is their twisted version of community service. Gameplay-wise, it also means that it's possible to have multiples of a single archetype in a squad, which means that the class limit has been removed. The class limit removal, I think, is I'm kind of mixed on it. On one hand, I can see how it could be a positive because it makes matchmaking a bit easier, because if, let's say, 100 people are on the server and they all picked Carillion, no one will find a match, right? But at the same time, it does make 2 stacks or 3 stacks possible. I haven't seen a 4 stack, but I have loaded into lobbies where there were 2 or 3 of the same class. It's a bit humorous, but it also gets a bit weird or awkward, especially in fights that require a bit more coordination. It's one of the reasons why I really regretted picking the veteran sharpshooter. I picked the sharpshooter and used that for most of it, but it seems that a vast majority of the player base this weekend also picked sharpshooter. So I think the number of times I was in a lobby where I was the only sharpshooter, I could probably count on one hand. On the other hand, you have the toughness system, which is basically kind of like a shield or an armor. Basically, most, if not all of the damage you take will go to your toughness first. Once your toughness wears out, then your health will be vulnerable. It's just another health bar. If you're an avid Payday 2 player, then you will feel right at home with this. Each class has the ability to regain toughness nearly on demand by either getting melee kills or, from my understanding, the first skill or first feat each character has another way of regenerating toughness at a rather rapid pace. I'm talking like 7% per second under the right circumstances. This, in my opinion, is a really good step forward from Vermintide, where most of the meta for your survivability was about blocking, where you had weapons that could help you block all of your attacks, because just blocking would shield you from nearly every attack under the sun, and then you would spec into weapons that would give an increase to block cost reduction, which means you can keep your block higher. Having a toughness system reduces the need for that. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't make the game free, especially on higher difficulties, and furthermore, blocking and having a melee fighting style that involves blocking is still very powerful, and it will get you far, but it's no longer, at least from my experience of trying the higher difficulties of Vermintide, it's if you let up your blocking for a little bit, oh, there goes half of my health. Now, don't get me wrong, the toughness doesn't make this game free, it doesn't make it easy. The game still has its own difficulties, but it does add a little bit of forgiveness, or a little bit of a grace, if you will, as well as adding a little bit more of a skill index. Like I said, each class has a handful of different ways of regenerating their toughness in and out of combats. So if you can play well, then you can get out of fights relatively unscathed. It's just now blocking is no longer necessary to do so. And to reiterate, blocking is still very good, is very useful and powerful, but it's no longer as vital as it once was. Another aspect I'd like to touch on is the gunplay. There's probably a lot of eyes on it, considering it's 40k, we're no longer in the ye old fantasy times. So you think, oh, are we going to be using our guns a bit more? And the answer to that is yes. As you could probably see on screen through some of the gameplay, you still have your primary and secondary weapons. You still have your melee and ranged. Now, do keep in mind, I did play most of the weekend as sharpshooter, where I'm a bit more aim and gun oriented. And I can say a sharpshooter has a passive that increases your ammo capacity. So with that in mind, I was it was to the point where I can go through entire missions and rarely touch my melee. I could just use my gun the entire time. In my opinion, this is a decent step away from Vermintide, where I usually only see people using their ranged weapons for like only on occasion and primarily using their melee, because there wasn't a lot of ammo to go around. Ammo was way more plentiful in Darktide, and combine that with having an increased ammo reserve from sharpshooter, and you can use your guns a lot more. It's no longer mandatory, but it does help a lot, especially versus the ranged enemies. But like I said, you could come in and treat this as if it were Vermintide and rely on your melee way more, and you'll still turn out just fine. That being said, I have a couple of qualms with the game, and that lies mostly with the specials and the outro sequences, or the ending sequences. The specials, I found myself having a lot of trouble with them. Most of the specials from Vermintide and Vermintide 2 have their equivalents in Darktide. So you have a Poxhound that's similar to the Assassin, you have a Trapper that's similar to the Pack Rat, and then you have a mutant that's similar to the Charger from Left 4 Dead 2 that will just dead charge you and will knock you out, and they can also grab you, slam you into the ground, deal lots of damage. It's great and totally fun. There were countless times where I would see them coming from a mile away and try to dodge them, or try to gun them down and would just fail to do so and would just get down because of it. I still think there's something wrong with either the hit reg or the hitboxes or stuff, because there were a couple of examples where I would clearly miss them. They would fly right past me, or there was a huge gap between me and them, and it would still count as a hit, which was just very infuriating. Combine that and with the way the game will prioritize or determine who gets pinned down, it really felt like I was getting singled out in the group a bit more than it should. There were several instances of enemies charging past the entire group just to target me for seemingly no reason. Here's one of the more egregious examples of that happening.
You have got to be fucking kidding me! Why? What the fuck? What?
Now, in the moment, I was clearly a bit heated, but however, in hindsight, I'm sure that there's something the game does to determine whether or not who to target that is just going completely over my head. Also, these are issues that hopefully will get better over time as the community learns how to handle these enemies better. That being said, my complaints with the hit registry still applies, as it did feel like that I was getting hit by enemies like a solid 10 feet away. I'm talking like there's a 10-foot gap between these enemies' poles and where my character is in the level. But again, the toughness system helps compensate for that, at least in some capacity. Moving on, the levels, it's hard to judge. There were only 4 missions that were available in the closed beta. The developers said that not all of the content that is planned to be in release was going to be in the closed beta, and they have their reasons for it, and I'm not going to challenge them on it. That being said, having those 4 missions played over and over and over again, everything did start to blend together. I was seeing some complaints on the Darktide subreddit and I think somewhere on Twitter and in the forums, where the levels all started to feel very samey, but I think that's only because we have a very small sample of the content that's actually in the game. That being said, there was one thing I saw that all 4 of these missions had in common, and that is the ending sequence being a little overtuned, at least in my opinion. So the last objective before you were done with the level and you could extract, I felt was a bit more difficult than the level would lead you to believe. There were countless times across numerous difficulties where I would load into a team where it felt like we had everything on lock, that we were very effective, we would have no downs, we would be able to do the objectives very cleanly, take the fights well, and then we would just completely wipe at the very end of the mission, in which we would lose, we would get reduced experience and rewards. So it felt like we were taking the time to do the entire mission, or nearly the entire mission, and getting half of the experience for it. So, that did feel a bit off-putting at times. So I don't know if this was just the community just getting used to the game, but I will say that is something to look out for, that if you do find yourself playing this game, just be prepared for that. Another thing you want to watch out for is the tagging system. So, like I said, there are a lot more ranged enemies this time around, and the game has a suppression mechanic, i.e., if you are just shooting in the general direction of someone, then they will flee for cover. If enemies are shooting in the general direction of you, you will be suppressed, which makes aiming a bit harder. There's also a tagging system which slows you down immensely, which unfortunately applies not only to enemy fire, but also to AoE. So you have certain enemies that will spew fire on the ground, or will either red or green fire, that will tag you. So if you are trapped in fire, or fire spawns around your feet, then you are stuck there for a little bit and you will take a lot of damage from that. And I really don't like that. I find that incredibly punishing. I get wanting to punish players for being out of position, or for just blindly running into battle if they're not prepared, but it feels like you're just getting trapped and in this endless loop of taking damage because you were tagged, getting tagged because you took damage. This is a common complaint that I saw in various circles in the community, so I'm hoping that Fat Shark does take that feedback and at the very least tones it down a little bit. overall, I really enjoyed this game. It was one of the few games where it would kind of captivate me to the point where I would just let time fly without realizing it. I try to keep my streams around like 4 to 5 hours, but 5 slipped to 7, which slipped to 8 without me even realizing it. It was to the point where Sunday, the last day of the beta, I actually cleared my schedule and wanted to commit to a 12-hour stream, and went for 13 instead, even though the beta actually only lasted 11 hours into that, because I misjudged when the beta would end relative to my time zone. I thought it would end at like 4 or 5 a.m. It ended at 3. So I got that going for me. So thankfully, Twitch recently reduced their minimum payout for affiliates and partners, which meant that I got my payout a bit earlier. So I'm definitely going to be committing or setting aside some of that to purchase on release. I will definitely be playing this more when there's more content, i.e. when it releases in November. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you everyone for stopping by. And I will see you all when I see you all.